I'd like to introduce our first panel this morning. Today we will have a panel and then a roundtable with Paul Carese, our founding director, and Harvey Mansfield. But to start out, we're going to have a panel on America 250, civic education and the upcoming anniversaries of the founding, with not only SCETL, but with the larger Centers Project, these series of new centers for civic education. One theme is the study of history and the study of the American founding and commemorating America's founding. And so that brings up a lot of important and useful thoughts with an anniversary coming up over the next few years. I was in a conversation with a journalist recently, and he said, think about how the bicentenary was celebrated. Gentleman in question was old enough to remember 1976, if not quite 1776, and talk about how the enthusiasm, the interest, the public attention that went into America 200. Well, what about America 250? And that's a good question. What does that attention or lack of it say about civic culture and civic education? Well, to engage some of those issues is our panel this morning. And I'm very glad to introduce our moderator, my colleague, Professor Andrew Porwancher. He's the Director of Graduate Studies here at SCETL at Arizona State University, and he came to us just this year from the University of Oklahoma. He's the author of 4 books, including The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton with Princeton University Press, which won a major award, the Journal of the American Revolution Book of the Year Award, in fact. He has been the May Fellow at Harvard, the Horn Fellow at Oxford, and the Garwood Fellow at Princeton. He's won a prize for mentorship from the American Political Science Association, and his other books include The Devil Himself, which was adapted for the stage at Dublin's historic Smock Alley. Welcome to Andrew Porwancher.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce our panelists, not just because they are leading figures in thinking about civic education, but because having a chance to spend a little bit of time with them over the last couple of days, they're both just really nice people. So that's what we do here at SCETL. First, I want to introduce our first speaker. Jonathan Gienapp is an associate professor of history and professor of law at Stanford University. He specializes in constitutional, legal, political, and intellectual history of the early United States. His scholarship focuses on the origins and early development of the U.S. Constitution. His first highly regarded book, The Second Creation, Fixing the American Constitution in the Founding Era, was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. And we look forward to his next book, which will unearth the forgotten history of the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gienapp.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being here bright and early on a Saturday morning. I know that's not cheap and easy, so I appreciate it. And I'd like to echo my thanks that has been offered over the last day and a half to all the conference organizers, Will especially, for allowing me to participate in what has been an extraordinarily rich set of conversations on a vitally important subject. So I come here wearing a few hats. Among other things, I'm a member of the Stanford Civics Initiative currently at the moment. So I've been involved in conversations of this sort at Stanford, and I'm excited to be involved in them here. But beyond that, as Andrew mentioned, I'm a historian of the founding era, who specifically focuses on the history of early constitutionalism. That's my day job. So I've long contemplated the questions that are at the heart of this panel. How should we teach this period that for so long has been bound up in American national identity and values? So if we are a creedal nation, as Danielle Allen mentioned yesterday, as so many believe, in which we anchor ourselves not in a particular ethnicity or religion or sense of peoplehood, but instead in the founding and the documents that it generated, there's no escaping that when you teach this material, it's really freighted with significance. It's obvious to virtually all the students that when we're studying this stuff, we're studying something more than just the history. We're not just talking about bicameralism or the Federalist Papers or Thomas Jefferson. We're talking about so much more. Now, that can pose a challenge as an educator. How is it that I can ensure that we maintain historical integrity in our investigation that doesn't devolve into myth-making or partisan scorekeeping, while at the same time drawing meaningful connections between that world and the one in which we currently live to produce not just good students, but also good citizens as well. So it's a challenge, but it's one that I relish, certainly. I never have to justify to my students or to anyone else that what we're studying is important. And the fact that it's so entwined with questions of civic education as well as public memory and commemoration, that elevates the stakes and really brings it to life for the students. And indeed, some of the classes that I've most enjoyed teaching through the years have rather consciously and expressly linked the history of the founding to our contemporary moment. So I teach a seminar on the history of constitutional originalism, which tries to look at the history of the US Constitution and how it came to be through the perspective of modern debates over how we should interpret it and the role history should play in that. And I also teach a freshman seminar on Thomas Jefferson and history and memory that tries to understand not just Thomas Jefferson in his own time, but how he became and has continued to exist as the so-called mirror of America, the symbol that Americans have been able to attach everything they think is good and bad in the entire nation's history to a single figure. And I found teaching these classes so fulfilling because they challenge the students and me to really think about how the founding lives in a very real sense today. So the task as I see it, as a teacher of this period, is to try to present the period in such a way that, one, it can invite people from all sorts of different backgrounds and points of view into the conversation, while two, stressing things about the period that are surprising, ironic, and/or complex, such that everybody involved ends up feeling unsettled and surprised. Nobody can settle for easy answers. So whether students feel drawn to the founding or alienated from it, whether or not they want to uncritically venerate it or just completely tear it all down, or whether, as is usually the case, people fall in between or trying to figure out what they think, the goal is always to try to move them past the familiar to something that is genuinely surprising. And I try to accomplish that by underscoring the era's dynamism. The founding was not a static set of ideas or a distinct moment in time that we can freeze and investigate. It was a process that unfolded over time and was propelled by real people engaged in civic work. So to get at this, I stress that the founding was first and foremost a debate over things that are the most important things one could debate. What it means to be free, what it means to be equal, the very point of constitutional government, what it means to make the people sovereign and to live out the ideal of self-government, who Americans are and who they ought to be. At the time of the founding, answers to these questions varied. Debates over them were charged, contentious, and often divisive. They were conducted by imperfect people because all people are imperfect, but they were also inclusive and empowering. By staking the nation to a set of broad principles, what the American Revolution had the effect of doing was empowering virtually everybody, including those traditionally shut out from power, to claim the revolution and its founding for themselves, to take up Thomas Paine's charge to, quote, begin the world over again. So among the things the founding did is it set up a set of genuinely public markers that set in motion an enduring debate over them, a debate that raged and has really never stopped. So it created a distinct kind of civic conversation with clear enough parameters to give it shape, but enough indeterminacy running through it to allow for plenty of play and creativity. And out of that conversation came our most important civic symbols. Those didn't just spring forth, they had to be made. So I try to show students that it was through debates over them and the meanings that those debates generated that the symbols that we share came to be. And I think they're really valuable civic lessons that follow from adopting this kind of dynamic perspective. If we see the founding as a dynamic conversation that did not end, it's easier for people to imagine themselves joining it. It's not just something that you either passively receive or actively contest. It's instead something that you can participate in and shape. And then two, it underscores that it was a struggle and therefore an achievement to build an enduring constitutional republic out of that disagreement. Again, that didn't just happen either, and it was not done in a way that ensured its future success. Nothing could ensure that. Founding era Americans created what they could from that debate, from disagreement, from compromise, understanding full well that it would be an ongoing project that would necessarily depend on a healthy civic culture if it was going to persist at all. So in portraying the founding as a dynamic conversation, I think it's much easier to grasp its civic depth and importance. So in my remaining time, I'll try to offer some concrete examples from the founding era that I tend to emphasize in my teaching to try to bring this sort of perspective to life, to show why it's easier to open up a period with a contested history to a broad collection of people by emphasizing how its contests invigorated its civic culture. So few things, I think, better illustrate the fact that the founding was not simply a set of principles laid down in fundamental documents, but the practice of putting those principles and documents to use as the personal struggle for freedom among enslaved people in revolutionary Massachusetts. So at the time of independence, slavery was practiced in all 13 of the states that now call themselves the United States of America. But that didn't stop one enslaved woman, Elizabeth Freeman, who lived in Massachusetts, from taking her case to court. With the help of a sympathetic lawyer in 1781, Elizabeth Freeman filed a lawsuit in state court claiming that her enslavement was inconsistent with Article I of the recently ratified Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Article I read, "All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights." Like many of the state constitutions, the Massachusetts Constitution explicitly incorporated the creed of the Declaration of Independence in order to establish the basis of its own government. And Elizabeth Freeman laid claim to these principles and put them to work. And remarkably, she succeeded. Not at first, but after several tries, the court finally found in her favor, and she was legally established as a free person. She was among the first enslaved plaintiffs to file what was called a freedom suit. She was in many ways the intellectual and legal ancestor of Dred and Harriet Scott, though their story would end up much differently. And she did so, as so many who followed would, on the basis of constitutional principles that might not have been written for her, but were hers all the same. Now, she was among the first, but she was not the last. Indeed, in short order, Freeman's suit was followed by another freedom suit, initiated by another enslaved person in Massachusetts by the name of Quackwalker. And like Elizabeth Freeman, Quackwalker also rested his case on the assertion that his condition of enslavement was inconsistent with the principles laid out in the Massachusetts Constitution and more broadly the Declaration of Independence. In 1781, Quackwalker had escaped from his master, believing that he was free. His master had tracked him down and severely beaten him, so Walker filed a lawsuit saying that he had been unlawfully a victim of assault and battery. And the ensuing legal struggle eventually made its way to the highest court in Massachusetts, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, where in 1783, on the instructions of Chief Justice William Cushing, who only a few years later would be one of the first justices appointed to the United States Supreme Court, in his instructions to the jury, declared that slavery was indeed inconsistent with Massachusetts state constitution, as William Cushing instructed the jury. As to the doctrine of slavery and the right of Christians to hold Africans in perpetual servitude, it is true that that has heretofore been countenanced, but a different idea has taken place with the people of America, more favorable to the natural rights of mankind and to that innate natural desire of liberty with which heaven, without regard to color or complexion, has inspired all the human race. And upon this ground, our Constitution of Government sets out with declaring that all men are born free and equal, and therefore the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our conduct and our Constitution. And after hearing these instructions from Massachusetts' highest-ranking jurist, the jury found Quackwalker free as well. And even more dramatically, when these suits were put together, the combined efforts of all these people, Elizabeth Freeman, Quackwalker, their sympathetic attorneys, William Cushing, had rendered slavery illegal in Massachusetts, something that the Massachusetts court shortly thereafter officially established. And this is how slavery was destroyed in Massachusetts. So people like Freeman, Walker, and Cushing are virtually unknown among Americans, but I think we would do well to commemorate them and make them a part of our civic education, because they show so well how founding documents and the principles embedded in them were often made through struggle and action and by unexpected protagonists. These Americans did not take no for an answer or give in to authority, nor did they oppose the founding and its principles. They thought it belonged to them. They laid claim to it in the most real way one could. And in so doing, they help breathe life into those principles and those documents that house them. And they're just one example of scores of Americans who did the same in the decades following independence. From debate, disagreement, and even rancor came a shared tradition with common symbols, one that was made ever more powerful and durable because of that vigorous civic activity of arguing through and under the very idea of a common founding. So the civic symbols at once channeled those debates, but were also the byproduct of them. America's founding documents came to be venerated because they were actively put to work in civic debate. That was certainly true of the United States Constitution. Getting it ratified by the summer of 1787 had required a bruising political fight in which nearly half of the American political public, those who were called anti-federalists, had opposed ratifying the Constitution, and not lightly either. They had spent nearly a year saying time and again that the proposed Constitution was a complete betrayal of the principles of the American Revolution. But what followed, however, was pretty remarkable. Rather than rejecting the Constitution's legitimacy, its former critics instead fought over how to interpret it. They laid claim to it for themselves, and they made it accountable as best they could to what they thought the revolution had been about. So debates over the decade that followed through the 1790s over how to interpret the Constitution raged, often in bitter and divisive ways, but they all ran through and under the Constitution. So who was the decisive winner to emerge from this process was almost certainly the Constitution itself. The activity of appealing to it as a common source of authority was what helped make it one. Now, how much the Constitution should be venerated was also something that was actively on the minds of the founding generation. They were deeply, deeply, deeply attuned to the problem of how it was that a Constitution could endure. It's one thing to set one up, it's another thing to ensure that it endures. They recognized that Americans needed to strike and cultivate the right balance between venerating a Constitution and emphasizing its inherent imperfections, a balancing act that was captured so perfectly well, as was the case of so many things, by James Madison, who was convinced, as he put it in Federalist 49, that a Constitution to endure depended on a certain measure of public veneration that only came with time and could not develop if people were constantly altering their political system and fundamental law. All governments, Madison recognized, rested on opinion, so a certain measure of veneration was indispensable. But at the same time, that veneration needed to be balanced by a recognition that the Constitution, like any Constitution, was inherently imperfect, something that he put so incisively in an earlier Federalist paper, Federalist 37, in which he explained anti-Federalists had been complaining endlessly, the Constitution is not perfect, we should redo it before we go through this ratification process. And he said, well, the Constitution is inherently imperfect because human beings are inherently imperfect, and especially the medium through which they communicate through one another, human language. Channeling what John Locke had earlier argued, Madison stressed language was a, quote, cloudy medium, always partial and imperfect, never quite supple enough to capture complex ideas, and that unavoidable imperfection of human communication and expression was only exacerbated when the object that you were trying to delineate was especially complex or novel, which certainly described the kinds of things that members of the Constitutional Convention had been trying to design. Consequently, Madison said, it was simply unavoidable that the Constitution would feature, quote, a certain degree of obscurity. But this wasn't a problem. It simply pointed to the truth that the Constitution would have to be, in a certain respect, an ongoing project, something that would need to be, as Madison put it, liquidated through ongoing practice, discussion, and adjudication. And that idea of it being an ongoing project based on certain imperfections was reinforced by the striking locution in the preamble that the founders were trying to create a more perfect union, an extraordinary turn of phrase. Not a perfect union, because human beings who are imperfect can never produce anything that is truly perfect, but they can produce something that is more perfect, and they can call upon subsequent generations who make up that one people, that people of the United States, to always strive for something more perfect as well. So Madison's emphasis on ongoing constitutional practice also underscored what most members of the founding generation instinctively understood as well, that a constitution was necessarily so much more than a system of government or a set of legal and political institutions. It always fundamentally depended on a supporting constitutional culture. The founding generation was uniquely aware of the problem of what constitutional law scholar Jack Balkin refers to as constitutional rot, the idea that a system can endure, but it can be enervated from within. So to avoid that unfortunate fate, what in the eyes of Americans had happened to the British Constitution, that the rot had set in, nothing was more important, and they said this time and time and time again, than civic education, nothing. Without a, quote, well-educated citizenry and, quote, a general diffusion of knowledge, the institutions, and thus freedom itself, stood very little chance. The Constitution could never be a machine that would go of itself without a supporting constitutional culture that recognized in some key sense its ongoing imperfections. So as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, as we strive to revitalize our own civic culture, what we spent a day and a half talking so deeply about, I think by understanding how the founding generation themselves understood that founding, and how they understood that it was just the beginning, by seeing that it was a debate that never ended or could or should end, and by understanding how the sorts of unifying symbols needed to sustain our civic culture were made through the struggles and claims of that culture, by seeing the founding, in other words, dynamically in motion, I think it becomes a whole lot easier to create the conditions today for the kind of shared disagreement that is essential to a pluralist democracy like ours. And when I'm trying to teach these subjects to a group of students from all sorts of different ideological backgrounds, that is what I try to promote in hopes that it will invite them into a conversation and recognize that it is, above all that, a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce Professor Elizabeth Kaufer Busch, who is the Laura and Pete Walker Professor in American Studies and the co-director of the Center for American Studies at Christopher Newport University. She serves on many boards, including the Jack Miller Center, the Washington Jefferson Madison Institute, the Civics and Engagement Task Force, which is one of several task forces that have been created for America 250, our upcoming celebration of a quarter of millennia of American life as an independent nation. It's a nonpartisan commission that was created by Congress to commemorate the nation's 250th anniversary. And in her research, Professor Busch has published work on civic education, administrative lawmaking, and the role that our evolving conceptions of sex, gender, and equality have on public policy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Busch.
Thank you. I'll begin by echoing what everybody has said. This has been a fantastic conference. It has sharpened my thinking on a number of ideas, and I'm looking forward to further conversations on these things. So the first talk was a great segue to mine because, first of all, I'm not a historian, only non-historian on stage. I don't claim to be. I might not be the best historian either. But I will say I think it is vital that students gain some sort of historical sense and historical memory about what's happened in our country. I'm more of an ideas person, and my classes focus on civics as ideas in conversation or ideas in conflict with one another. And so I'm focusing on the second half of the question that was posed to us. First of all, how do you teach a contested historical narrative? And how do we commemorate the past? And these are almost one and the same when you think in terms of the upcoming 250th anniversary. So my answer to this question is that, first of all, let's look at what the 250th anniversary is commemorating. It's the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's not the anniversary of the Constitution. So what are we celebrating? Well, that depends on what kind of document that you think the Declaration of Independence is. What do we think this document is attempting to achieve? And we're in an era where we have two irreconcilable views of what this document allegedly says. So my talk is going to contrast what I call the founding ideals of the Declaration, or I collectively term this the American proposition, with what I'm going to term an anti-constitutionalist, an irreconcilable worldview adopted in many classrooms today. And I'm going to argue that professors of civics should accurately portray both worldviews. I don't think it's appropriate to try to push one worldview and destroy the other. Because what we're trying to do as civics educators is to prepare students to live in the world as mature adult citizens. And indoctrinating them does nothing to allow them to do so, to maneuver in the world in an appropriate way. So this necessarily leads to my next point, that I very much view my role as a professor to teach, not to preach. And teaching means sharing ideas through primary text, letting authors speak for themselves, and allowing those authors to be in conversation or conflict. I mean, it's often very much conflict, as was just discussed. And then let students judge for themselves, let them understand the ideas, take them in, and with their own critical thinking, judge for themselves what seems persuasive or not, and why. We should not, in commemorating America 250, ignore the failures and the missteps. That's very much part of the story. However, and I think this should be stressed, it's not the whole of it. So the bicentennial was mentioned a few moments ago. The bicentennial, now I was too young to remember, what exactly the celebration was. I do remember the commemorative coins, and so I'm really excited to see the 250th commemorative coins. I think we should all search for those and collect them, because it'll be a great memento to have for our children and children's children. But I do remember it as a celebration. And what's been most interesting in my short time on America 250, so I was originally on the Civics and Civic Engagement panel, or committee. They changed the name, and it now focuses on American history and America's future. And it's a much larger committee. The other thing to understand about America 250 is that it's a bipartisan commission, not a nonpartisan commission. So what you tend to get are advocates on both sides, rather than nonpartisan individuals trying to come to some consensus. It's more advocates trying to include their part of the narrative that they think should be perpetuated. So again, I'm going to argue that we need to put these two worldviews in conversation. So let's just very basically look at the contested historical narrative as I understand it. 21st century America is a house divided. We aren't divided today over policy disputes. It would be great if we could get back to actually disputing policy. The real rift in our country right now, as I see it, is that we are split between two irreconcilable worldviews. One I call the American proposition, and the other, so my co-author and I are debating over semantics here. So I like the term anti-constitutionalist, he likes the term rejectionist, but you get the gist, all right? I also tend to describe it in terms of an oppressor-oppressed paradigm. So I will lay that out. What is the American proposition? And this comes from the Declaration. The Declaration, as was said earlier in this conference, is the why. Why do we exist? Why do we come together? We are not like other nations brought together by a singular race, by a singular ethnicity, by a singular religion. We are built on ideas, and that's part of the uniqueness of the American experiment. So we need to ask what those ideas are, and we need to understand what those ideas are. Humans are equal, and they have unalienable rights. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two, Government is needed due to human imperfection, and I'm glad we're using the same term because I think it's the right note. And the Constitution must limit the leaders and also the people, so we can't do whatever we want, even though we are the foundation of the government's authority. What we have today in response to this are anti-constitutionalists or rejectionists, both on the left and on the right. And this is very generic, so I'm going to give a layout. Anti-constitutionalists believe the ends justify the means. So you don't have to confine yourself to constitutional limitations, process requirements, and the like. So that means they're going to, in the words of our president, I'm going to support this even though it might not pass constitutional muster, right? That means things like violent protests are appropriate. And we have this on the left and the right, It does skew one direction more than the other. As long as their goal is just, they can follow whatever means. And just is in the eye of the beholder. So whoever's, pushing for their particular policy or worldview, they define what is just. So the most prominent version of this anti-constitutionalism is the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, which I will get to. First, let me get a little deeper into what the American proposition is. So the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, the backdrop of this is, ask yourself, okay, we're commemorating the Declaration of Independence. As Frederick Douglass asks, why the heck are we doing that? Is this document something to be revered? Is this document something that is a lie? That's really what we're asking ourselves today. And the folks who believe it's a lie are not going to agree with the folks who believe this is a document about human equality. So we've got to come up with some way. And again, I think instead of shrinking from it, what we need to do is face it head on. And face it head on fairly. So the first premise, that humans are equal and endowed with unalienable rights, lead to a couple of more specific observations in the Declaration. First of all, these unalienable rights come from a creator and or nature. I think the Constitution is broad enough to include a secular worldview, a view based on human nature, a view based on an omnipotent God. It does not specify that one or the other of those principles are needed, but it does specify there's some sort of principle above human choice that has determined that. The equality is in a very specific sense in the possession of rights. And finally, the only proper end of government then is to protect these rights. That's as the Declaration puts forth. Our second premise, that we need government, right? Governments are instituted to protect these rights. Well, why the heck do we need a government in the first place? Well, there's some kind of problem in human nature, or we would be able to get along. And it doesn't even require that many humans to make a problem for the rest of us. So humans are imperfect. Now, to some that's going to mean sinful, to some that's going to mean fallen, and to others that's going to mean we're corrupt, we're naturally evil, selfish, and to some it's going to be we just make mistakes. But all of those are encapsulated in that. Our rights are only going to be secure with some form of government. The authority for this government can only come from us. It comes from the consent of the governed, and again, we, the people who consent to form this government, are not perfect ourselves. So we're going to need some kind of checks, leading to the third premise. Our government leaders are also human beings. They may not seem so today, but they are. And they're imperfect as well. So we need to devise mechanisms that control and limit the government and control and limit we the people. So there is an irony that we give the authority to this eventual constitution, and we adhere to it, and it has a status above we the people, and yet we the people gave it its authority. So there is a paradox there. What stems from this is governments, we know, are comprised of humans, not angels. Number protective mechanisms and we would need a written constitution. So checks and balances, separation of powers. I'm in my study of administrative lawmaking. Yuval Levin yesterday was preaching to me on the need to get back to the understanding of how the Constitution was designed. A written Constitution also limits the people and the protections. So these protective mechanisms are the means through which government operates. The protection of individual rights are the end goals. And the Declaration really lays out all these things, and then its counterpart, the Constitution, lays out the processes. So you get the end goals from the Declaration and the processes from the Constitution. Now, the anti-constitutionalist or rejectionists, the ends justify the means. So you don't necessarily need to follow processes. You don't necessarily need to follow the Constitution. Now, the most prominent of this today, I'd say, is the institutional racism argument and the 1619 Project. There are many others, though. So I teach a class on the evolution of the American experiment, and I look at intellectual challenges to the American proposition as the country has developed through the Industrial Revolution and otherwise. So I call this anti-constitutionalist worldview the oppressor-oppressed paradigm. And this is primarily on the left. There are anti-constitutionalists of the right. I can talk about that in the Q&A if folks would like. So the goal of the oppressor-oppressed paradigm is empowerment. It is not protection of rights. It's empowerment of the oppressed. Individuals in this view are defined by their membership in particular identity groups. So it's group right versus individual rights, such as their skin color, sex, sexual preferences, whatever. In particular, some groups are always the oppressed and others are always the oppressors. And the oppressed have the moral correctness and the oppressors do not. Concepts such as free speech, religious liberty, and due process are contrary to the so-called common good or help to perpetuate the oppression of the oppressed. And the Constitution can also be viewed in that way. This is just, government is a tool used to oppress. So the story of institutionalized racism is that all of these institutions came about in order to perpetuate and further the institution of slavery. It turned into Jim Crow. It turns into racism. So the whole system is stained with blood. There's nothing good about it. So that gives us an entirely different view of the Declaration of Independence. When viewed through that lens, we shouldn't commemorate this document. We should overcome it. We should replace it. We should rethink the entire structure of society. A second premise of this is that there's no fixed human nature. And so if there's no fixed human nature, there's no fixed or permanent flaws. This means they also do not see human nature as inherently flawed, and it's an openness, it's an opportunity for perfecting or changing or making us better, making us our better selves. So the reason that people misbehave is because the oppressors have made it so. And so we need to take the oppressors out of their privileged position and allow the oppressed to reorganize. So remove the oppressors, remove the apparatus of oppression, and restore the oppressed to a better state. Not necessarily better nature, but a better condition. The fundamental assumption here is that the nature of is about the nature of humanity. People can be changed by the government to embrace a new understanding of justice or a new understanding of the common good. And finally, governments exist to pursue justice or the common good. These goals and justice, the oppressed define what that is, because the oppressors have no sense of justice. They define justice as equity or a new sense of empowering the oppressed because they have experienced a lack of power, and therefore they have a justification not only for redefining it, but they're morally right because they're morally correct because they're able through their oppression to see the reality of the situation. And they perhaps can pave the way for a utopian notion of society and or utopian notion of humanity, and this means we can put in place experts, they can correct us. There's often an openness or a lack of specifics on what ultimately this is going to look like, but there's a fundamental difference in the limitations of human nature in the American proposition and the openness to change human beings. And on the one side, you really need to show both because they're irreconcilable. And students, adults, all of us have to see which side we find more persuasive. All right, so once we get a clearer view of these two worldviews, we can better understand the nature of debate today. What's really dangerous and troubling in our society is not a particular policy dispute. We can't even get to that because we can't even agree on the plane by which we're disagreeing. We can't even agree that we need to follow law and process. We can't even agree that the Constitution is the law of the land. And so we need to have that conversation first, and then we can get in the weeds of policy. And alas, my time's over, so maybe in Q&A I can flesh some of this out a little more.
Thank you so much to both of you for such thought-provoking talks. I want to turn first to Professor Gienapp, and you talked about one of these early freedom suits, and I often think about the Declaration of Independence as a political document, and you were talking about its invocation as a legal document. I'm wondering if you think there are constitutional issues today that would be better illuminated if we thought about them in the context of the Declaration of Independence as a kind of almost binding or quasi-binding legal document that could inform how we think about the constitutional text?
That's a big question. I think if nothing else, I think something we have lost that was alive and well in the founding generation was an understanding of the synergy between the blueprint and its means of execution. So part of the way the Declaration of Independence receives its legal status is because most of the state constitutions, many of them directly copied parts of the Declaration of Independence into them, but all of them took what they took to be its guiding principles and laid them down as its basis. But they also had a way of understanding how a constitutional document was unfolding and what it was referenced to that we don't easily see as much now. So the original meaning of a constitution referred to the frame of government, which rested upon a social compact. Now, by the time you get to the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, the word constitution has capaciously expanded to more or less describe all of this. But the way in which a lot of the state constitutions were written was you would first begin by defining the people. We are a people, the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, later the people of the United States of America. Well, what is this people? And these statements that pulled on the Declaration of Independence and then were usually followed by a Declaration of Rights were not trying to articulate clear legal content as much as they were trying to identify the essential fundamental reasons why these people had entered into a constitution of government. And then the frame of government that followed was the institutional scheme that would help realize these ends. But when it came to understanding what did or did not have the status of fundamental law, they didn't think there were sharp breaks between these things. What the government could or could not do, how it could or could not regulate certain aspects of human affairs or entrench on certain spheres of liberty, required a holistic understanding of the relationship between Constitution 1, the social compact, the we, what we have created as a polity, and Constitution 2, the frame of government. And the Declaration of Independence was often, very explicitly by a number of people. James Wilson was a leading framer who said you couldn't begin to understand either the Articles of Confederation or the United States Constitution unless you understood how the Declaration of Independence was a constitution of the underlying social compact of America. How we might revivify that today in modern jurisprudence is a very complicated question because modern doctrine in federal courts doesn't really leave space for this. But I think as a civic conversation, we might understand why the founding generation refused to draw distinctions that have now grown familiar to us because it is very striking. I mean, the reason why students are usually pretty amazed when they hear the stories of Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker, not least because of what it leads William Cushing, who becomes, again, one of the first justices on the Supreme Court to articulate, which is there is, of course, a relationship between these fundamental principles that we have specified as the basis of our social compact and the legal guarantees as a citizen of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And that slavery is inconsistent with that proposition. All the other northern states pretty much pass gradual emancipation statutes to end slavery, which is how the North becomes free. That's not true in Massachusetts. It's ended by freedom suit, by judicial process, based on what the Massachusetts Constitution provides. So, I mean, at minimum, I think it would be very useful as a civic conversation to invite people to draw more of these connections between the Declaration of Independence, the preamble, the US Constitution, the state constitutions. Remember, we have 51 constitutions in this country, not one. And to see the synergy, because they saw the synergy, and sometimes we don't.
Thank you. I want to turn now to Professor Busch, and you spoke so forcefully about the problems with this oppressor-oppressed paradigm and this view of American history that is wholly blind to any sort of merit in the founding or in the subsequent quarter millennia that's passed. Perhaps there's another faction that we might not think of as anti-constitutionalists, but rather as triumphalists who want to tell a story of American history that if one side's wholly blind to the feats, the other side's wholly blind to the failures. And in calling, as you have admirably, for, I think, a more intellectually honest approach, one that grapples with the complexity of the American experiment, why is it that it seems difficult for people to assume a posture that's open to that kind of complexity? And as we look ahead to the 250th anniversary, what can we do to try to encourage people to be open to engaging with a very difficult topic?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, one of the problems it has been that teachers, both at the K-12 and at the university level, see their jobs differently than many used to. They're not necessarily purveyors of content. They're perhaps have some sort of social justice motivation in mind. And that's what I mean by the formulation of teach, don't preach. Because if we really want to participate in civics as teachers, right, and to teach the civic lessons out there, we need to allow students to have the dialectic in their own mind, right, between opposing views. And I will also say, as a side note, that this oppressor-oppressed philosophy is one way of being an anti-constitutionalist. And I really like your how did you say it, triumphalist? Yeah, we've engaged in coming up with some of these good words. You're a good academic if you create new terminology. But yeah, that certainly exists, the folks that are blind. And some of those folks would fall into what I call anti-constitutionalists on the right. And there are a number of different types of anti-constitutionalists on the right. These folks also see that the ends justify the means. Some of them are the Catholic integralists. Some of them are the common good constitutionalists. They go by a number of different names, and they seek to impose a particular view of common good or justice through extra-constitutional methods, I would say. And the oppressor-oppressed tends to be more prevalent on the left, that particular formulation of it. I think this honest conversation between the two is really the only way to crack into the minds of students who are absolutely 100% sure their view of our country is correct. And unfortunately, we have more and more people who have that absolute certainty, which is just an anomaly to me because I've never had absolute certainty about anything as an academic. And so you have to do what Socrates did so well, which is be their friend, adopt the idea, talk to them about why it's so persuasive. Why is this so persuasive? Why is this so attractive to believe we can liberate ourselves from this, the ugliness we see around us. And, go ahead, and ask them to judge for themselves.
Please.
One quick thing. Part of the reason I mentioned, James Madison was such an astute student of the idea of constitutional endurance and veneration, and his understanding of the distinction between veneration, which was essential, and blind veneration, which was corrosive, is really useful. I mean, here's a really thoughtful guy who said, well, what happens when veneration turns blind? It ceases to be guided by anything of content and instead gets replaced by myth, narrative, and no longer leaves open the space which is so essentially created by that gap of where a citizen understands civic responsibilities. And he was I think you can learn a lot from emphasizing that.
And he was a master of describing the way you could channel that human imperfection into coming to some kinds of compromise. And he recognized the importance of veneration, but one of the potential critiques here is producing that civic culture that we need to support it. Maybe could have used more attention. Tocqueville's a great person to read for some ideas on this, but Tocqueville predicted religious fanaticism and other forms of fanaticism, and so I think that's an example of one of them, the blind devotion.
Thank you. Let me turn back to Professor Gienapp, and in thinking about the founders, people often will say, well, the founders couldn't have anticipated so much. They couldn't have anticipated, modern arms. They couldn't have anticipated modern commerce. I'm curious to ask, what about American civic life today would have been the most recognizable to the founding generation? What would have surprised the founders the least about America at 250?
Interesting. I've never been given that question before. I thought you were asking the opposite. That is a good question.
I got to keep you on your toes.
I know,
here.
right? What would they be surprised the least by? I'd like to think the ongoing capacity for self-government. A problem they recognized, which we have an easier time eliminating, was how do you turn revolutionary struggle into enduring constitutional settlement? The American Revolution was a revolution. Predicated on violence and overthrowing one form of government, replacing it with another, with a very divided population. The majority of people, of white people living in British North America, did not support the American Revolution. It's unclear exactly how many were loyalists, how many were moderates. Many were stuck in between, just trying to figure it out. This is messy and divisive, and there's a lot of bloodshed. And there used to be a myth of the sort of bloodless American Revolution. It is very hard to transition from one form of government without certain costs. And the road out of that was not easy. You look at the 1780s, people who had been fervent patriots and revolutionaries were very angry at loyalists who remained in America. And there's a lot of punitive legislation passed, some of those prominent of which was passed in New York. So people like Alexander Hamilton and others, who were practicing attorneys, took it upon themselves to defend loyalists against these laws that persecuted loyalists, like the Trespass Act in New York, which basically said the British Army has occupied New York City during the Revolutionary War, so all those people who stayed and occupied former houses and businesses that belonged to patriots, well, you owe back taxes on all that property you used during the Revolution at a punitive rate that would have put anybody out of business. So Hamilton and others say, this is precisely what it means to persecute an unpopular minority. And if we do this, the revolution will never end. And we need to end the revolution. And reaching a constitutional settlement, first at the state level and then at the federal level, was very difficult work that they were conscious of. It didn't just happen. And most countries don't end that way. the French Revolution does not end in enduring constitutional settlement. It profoundly fails in that regard. So I think one thing that would, I hope surprise them the least was the fact that the framework that had been part of their settlement and their recognition of what went into that settlement had endured. And they recognized the challenges, so I don't think they would also not be surprised to hear that we had challenges. The idea there are fundamental divisions. The 1790s are a contest in which two sides say the other side is opposed to the very idea of America. I mean, that was the rallying cry of the Jeffersonian Republican Party. The Federalists are monarchists and aristocrats, and I mean, and they found a way through the Constitution, under the Constitution, to resolve this peacefully. And that's something to study and recognize moving forward.
Just a question of clarification. So you think they'd be least surprised that the idea of self-government can endure, but what about that this particular Constitution would endure as long as it did?
Well, I think that's a good question, whether they'd be surprised by that. I think they would be gratified, because I think they recognized that they were trying to do something, the prospects of success of which were not high. I mean, again, pretty much everything that human beings had made that was devoted to the proposition of freedom had failed. I mean, there weren't many republics around the world. Republics failed. That was the hard form of government. Monarchies were easy. Most former republics had long since decayed. Most constitutions, especially the British Constitution, that's the greatest constitution that had ever existed in Americans' eyes. It had been rotted out from the inside. So there was going to be nothing easy about setting up one's own constitutional system that would last not just 10 years.
As Jefferson wanted.
Yes, exactly.
So let me put one more question, this one for Professor Busch, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions for our panelists here. So Professor Busch, you are going to be one of the leading voices determining how this country memorializes its 250th anniversary. Are there models either at home or overseas that you think are particularly instructive for America to follow? Or are there models that you think that we should avoid?
Models of
how historical events have been memorialized. Are there examples from the American Civil War, from South Africa, is there anything that is there a country that you think is doing this particularly well?
I don't know. I have the background to answer that particular question because I'm not that familiar. I do think that looking at comparative constitutions could be a very interesting aspect of the celebration. And it can be a model for looking at, well, what kinds of rights does this Constitution in the United States protect, and how has it done so? And how has it failed to do so and then redeemed itself and then failed to do so again and attempted to redeem itself? Versus, say, a constitution like South Africa that offers a number of what I would call positive rights, rights that the government grants rather than rights that come from above human beings, and their ability or inability to provide those things. So, you may have a right to a basic income, a house, your basic needs, but if the government can say that and then not provide it.
Well, let me tweak the question slightly, if I could. So, do you think there's a particular misconception or a key aspect of our founding that you'd like to see 2026 be a kind of corrective for? Like, what do you think the public needs to most understand that they're not grasping?
I think, first of all, that this should be a celebration. Otherwise, why commemorate it in the first place? So just very basically that there is something to commemorate. And then comes the question of what that is. And I do think the what that is has to be at a very broad, general, basic level. I think that it simply is the case that whether we're aware of it or not, there's a dedication to individual rights. We don't agree on what those rights should be, on what those rights mean. There's an agreement on some level of human equality, human dignity. Again, there's a plethora of definitions and understandings of what that equality means. To commemorate the rarity of our Constitution, even though it's not a celebration of the signing of the Constitution, but the bloodless way in which we replaced, I also think it's worth thinking about in 2026, what could we do if we had a constitutional crisis of sorts? It couldn't be changed the way it was before. So what could and would we do? And, I would like, this might sound overly optimistic, but I would like an understanding of this irreconcilability of the way some of us are thinking about things so that people can decide where their hearts really are. And I think when we do that, most, not all, Danielle Allen said, 70%? I mean, she may be right on that. Most will find something to commemorate, that there is such a thing as human nature, that it isn't perfect, but that we are good in that we can govern ourselves. And that's a thing to celebrate, because it means we're not destined to tyranny. And so to reestablish a plane upon which we can productively and civilly disagree with one another.
I'm sure if we had a second Constitutional Convention, SCETL would be happy to host. And on that note, I will invite folks to the microphone who want to put questions to our esteemed panelists here. Please.
Thank you so much. Wow, what really great comments. And I have a comment or question for both, not a comment, a question for both. That's all right. So Professor Gienapp, really thoughtful presentation. And as you were talking, I was trying to understand better your idea of dynamism. And so I was wondering, would you consider the way in which the United States received the common law from England an example of dynamism, yay or nay? So I'm just trying to get a better understanding of your concept of dynamism. My thought is that there is some dynamism there. So there was reception, but some modifications to fit the circumstances of the United States. And if there is relative stability, maybe compared to the dynamism of the Declaration or the Constitution, which I take to be your position, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, is it the case, or how does one participate in the relatively static phenomenon of the common law or some other aspects that's less dynamic, and maybe we can't participate in it because it lacks dynamism? So I'm trying to understand what dynamism is, and then how do you participate if something isn't dynamic in that phenomenon?
Okay. Yeah, great question. So I'm first and foremost emphasizing dynamism pedagogically as a way to think about constitution making during the period. That in any one state constitution, there's an elaborate process with a lot of give and take back and forth. And then there's process with the Articles of Confederation, and then the road to the federal constitution. So reminding ourselves that it was not just a set of things, but it was a set of conversations, out of which came so many of the things that we recognize, and in which the conversation, which was essentially dialectical, people exchanging in the precise ways we hope will happen in classrooms, people disagreeing and reaching toward better understanding of one another, and what comes out synthetically from that process is the precise kind of thing that I think the founding is. And that's what I want to draw attention to. Whether it also speaks to a kind of legal dynamism that you're pointing to is, I think, also a really sort of rich and interesting question that I think the adoption of the common law illustrates in other ways, because like so many founding era symbols that are at once being appealed to but also shaped and made by those appeals, that's also true of the common law, especially because it has a paradoxical identity. What is the common law in 1790? Does it refer to the decisions of British common law courts? Does it refer to the long-standing customs of British social life? Does it refer specifically to the rulings of common law courts in the colonies in the early United States, or the customs of those colonies? Have they existed long enough to have a common law? Or does the common law itself point to the underlying essential principles of fundamental law that are best revealed by looking at long practice? Because that exposes, it's the best evidence of natural law, a lot of people said. James Wilson said it's the best marker of consent, because whatever people have sort of customarily accepted, acquiesced to, understood, breathed life into over the ages. So there was a way in which you could adapt the common law while very much transforming what someone in the British legal tradition would think the common law is. And I think those sorts of things happened a lot during the period, but again, inspired certain sorts of debates that were really important and had a dynamic quality to them.
That, to your first point, that appreciation and recognition of the debates is so important, and it also shows us why when people say, well, the founders intended to protect and spread slavery, there is no the founders believed. What we have are documents that are results of compromise, and they sum up some of the things some people believed and some of the things, I call a compromise something where everyone walks away from the table unhappy. No one got exactly what they wanted. Some people wanted the Declaration flooded with religious references, particularly Judeo-Christian. And so the dialectic is not only important for doing civics, but in recognizing the complexity of the agreements. And I think that also helps to undermine the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, because it's a very simple, there's this unified oppressor that has a singular purpose, and it's very attractive in that regard, because you can identify who and what's evil and what you need to do. But that's an overly simplistic understanding, really, of how human beings create and develop.
I'll just also quickly, one thing that just occurred to me, Lee, because as you might have gathered, I spent a lot of time with my students emphasizing the importance of the state constitutions as the basic blueprint from which the federal constitution is eventually derived. The New York State Constitution has a remarkable provision in there. Article 35 says, the common law shall be in effect in New York up until April 19th, 1775. So anything that has happened in the common law after the first shots at Lexington and Concord is not legally incorporated, but everything up to that date. Well, what does that mean? Alexander Hamilton has posed this question in the mid-1780s. What is the common law? What does that mean up to April 19, 1775? And he says, well, it might mean a particular discrete set of legal procedures that are typically found in English common law courts and rulings. But he says, but I don't think that's really what it's about. I think what we mean by the common law is what we consider the most fundamental principles of our inherited constitutional tradition as Anglo-American people, and that's what we incorporated. But even that right there, they're saying, what did we mean when we put that down? And it provokes this creative debate, which then when you get to the federal constitution, it incorporates these things that look common law-like, Fifth Amendment, other sorts of things, provoke similar conversations, which ultimately reduces the question, who are we? And based on that, what have we committed ourselves to? Which I think, is you can't ever go wrong forcing students and the general public to wrestle with that proposition.
If I may ask,
Please,
Mr.
go
Busch.
ahead.
So thank you for your comments as well, and I take it from your conversation that you have a view about which of the two perspectives you identified as true and accurate regarding the perspective on the United States' founding. So I guess one of the points you had made was that that you think a faculty member is enjoined to present both perspectives, and I took it to be as a corollary to not endorse one perspective or the other. Is that true? Okay.
Yeah, and it might,
And I guess I was wondering why that's the case. Is it a situation of role morality where, as a faculty member at maybe a public university, one has an obligation to present what are the kind of conventional views out there? Is it a perspective on the epistemic warrant of the proposition that you believe is true, but you don't have enough confidence in it to think of it? Because I imagine if I was, for example, in the science department, and when you look at polling data, most Americans, 60-ish%, think that humans did not evolve from lower forms of organisms. But I think as a science faculty member, I would articulate what the scientific discipline has. And so I'm wondering why you would present both perspectives, including what you clearly think is incorrect.
I think it has to do with the fact that so many students just believe wholeheartedly the alternate narrative without having actually read the documents that could lead them to form an opinion on their own. And with emotionally charged issues like racism, slavery, I don't think it's a particularly useful method to try to push that this is what you should believe. I don't think that allows a student to make the idea their own. And so I think it's one of my personal moral principles as a professor, and as someone who studied classical political philosophy in graduate school quite a bit, the Socratic method opens your mind and opens your soul to turn around and see things in a different way. And to me, that's what true education is. I think if you're indoctrinated to the wrong view, that obviously has problems with it. If you're indoctrinated to the right view, that may be more intractable in some ways. So, you know, who's your more challenging student? The one who agrees with you but has no understanding as to why. And if we're going to promote a citizenry, we talked about the fact that there's this lack of true leadership. I'd use the term statesmanship. We need people who can really think through problems, who have a moral compass and understand why they have it. These are moral worldviews, and they're both very attractive. And so just a little example from class. You know, a couple years ago, I asked my students something about Marx and the preamble to the manifesto, and not a single one had ever read a word from Marx, but they certainly were conversant with some of the ideas, clearly from someone who had told them what Marx believed. And so I assigned Marx, and I assigned selections of Malcolm X versus MLK, and I assigned versions of 1619 versus arguments of Jefferson about the Declaration. And even the students who were very strongly on the oppressor-oppressed model said, well, okay, it might not be true, but it's useful. Yes, it's useful to think a different way. And so I think that's a victory. That's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the panel, and both of the panelists. Delighted that the common law came up as a background principle. And in reference to the state constitutions sort of debate and dialogue, let it be known for the record, Professor Beinberg, that SCETL produces 2 pocket constitutions, and everyone's swag bag has 2 pocket constitutions, the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Arizona.
The longer one.
Well, but with Professor Beinberg's expert knowledge, this is the essential Arizona Constitution, the abbreviated, edited version. My question or comment, if both of you would reply to it, a figure I think could usefully be brought into the conversation here is Herbert Storing, professor at University of Chicago, when he conceived of this thought that the anti-federalist writings ought to be collected. And there are criticisms of he didn't get all of them, but further, so this is in the 1970s further, he should produce and edit a 1-volume edition of the best of the anti-federalist writings, which the anti-federalists didn't do, right? Hamilton is the architect of the Federalist, Publius. Because, Storing argued, the United States arose from debate. In particular, he's thinking about the 1787 Constitution, but it's true of the Declaration as well. And he writes in this marvelous essay what the anti-federalists are for. I think that someone will remind me. I think that's where it is.
Yes, it's fantastic.
He thinks the Federalists had the better of the argument. But you can't really understand America and even be sure that the Federalists had the better of the argument unless you know the anti-federalist argument. Is that, in fact, the spirit of what you are? And just one, this is not postmodernism or post-structuralism. There's a parameter. There are parameters to this. There are common principles. There's a shared arena of argument, but there is argument there. So if you would respond.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's exactly right. The one thing I would slightly amend that I emphasize to students is from the perspective of 1787, you could certainly argue that the anti-federalists, if they didn't have the better argument, they had the easier argument to make, the more conventional argument, the one more rooted in what was persuasive. The rhetorical challenge was on the Federalist side, because the claim that this proposed Constitution violates the principles of the American Revolution was a claim that had substance. Every thoughtful person who'd ever been referred to as an authority on politics had made it clear that republics had to exist over a small space with a relatively homogeneous society. So from Montesquieu on down, that was proof positive that you couldn't have an extended republic. So the challenge that the Federalists faced, they could have either said, well, we were committed to a set of principles on which we waged the revolution. Those haven't quite worked. We'll abandon them. Or to do a creative act of reconciliation out of genuine innovation and to show how not only was an extended republic consistent with the revolutionary principles, but as Madison argues in Federalist 10, is a much better device for redeeming them. And this was true of a number of, I mean, you can run down sort of the list of how anti-federalists really leveraged the principles of the spirit of 1776 to indict 1787. But the only reason those Federalist arguments existed is because they had to answer this charge. I mean, why does the Federalist Papers exist? They are position papers in the New York press with the sole purpose of ensuring a majority at the New York ratifying convention to answer the attacks that are being made in that same New York press, first and foremost by Brutus, whoever that might be. We still struggle to all agree on who wrote some of these things. But they are answers, right? And as I think we all know, what is the value of exchange and conversation and debate is not simply that you get rival points of view on the table, it's that each of us gets a better understanding of what we actually think and why from that process. It's generative, it sharpens, it brings something that's latent to the surface and gives it a form that it would have previously lacked. The arguments in the Federalist Papers are that. So if they are right moving forward, as in they're saying something that's essentially true of not just our system, but Republican government more generally, many of them wouldn't have existed in the formulation they did without the anti-federalists hammering them on why this thing that the Philadelphia Convention had done was a break from conventional orthodoxy that therefore required a response that explained why it was not, why they had not left the cave but only expanded it. And that's really important, I think.
Moreover, they can help us understand some of our shortcomings today. They were extremely wise. It amazes me how far into the future they could see at that time. They had just had this short constitution that failed. They could have given up. I would amend your comment just a little bit to say not giving up on the principles, but giving up on how, the design, right? How to achieve those principles. But when I start just after the Declaration and I get into the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, I say, well, you know, the Federalists won, so why are we reading the losers? But that's not a fair way to look at this debate. They, as you said, shaped the terms of the debate. They made it a better constitution. They made it a much better constitution. And I do think there's worth to keeping every single one of those anti-federalist papers because the anti-federalists were not of one view on all the branches of government. You know, they had different notions. And so when we look at those who would do away with the Constitution, think there needs to be radical revision, one can look to those different arguments and still weigh, well, maybe that would have been better. And I would say at our critical points in American history, we can find analogous debate, not over how to shape the Constitution, but how to bring about civil rights, how to overcome the failings of slavery, how to live up to the principles in a way that we had failed, how to come to terms with that we're not going to agree that desegregation is the only consistency with the founding principles.